Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Jonathan Berger, and I'm the director of ADWSE Gallery across the park, where I had the good fortune to work with Max Schumann on putting the Printed Matter exhibition together. He really spearheaded it and did an incredible job. And it's been really, really incredible for all of us at the gallery to work on going through the archive and also to be in the gallery with all the material and with the amazing resident artists we have working there all the time. If you haven't been, I just encourage you to go. There's one more day, Valentine's Day. Bring your loved one. And we have like a closing event tomorrow night, 6 to 8. That's being hosted by Red 76, who are artists in residence, and they have a great thing they're putting together, so please come to that. And I just want to thank Keith Gray and Kate Beach, who really worked to put tonight together logistically and just did a great job, and also all the staff at ADWSE and at Printed Matter, and all the residents who are overworking in the studios in the exhibition. Thank you to Judson Church, and thank you so much to the panelists, really, for being here. You're our heroes, so thank you. And I just want to say briefly, I grew up in New York City and I grew up going to Printed Matter, and I know it's the case for a lot of us. I think it's remained now for 40 years a place that makes people who maybe wouldn't feel that they have access to the so-called art world, makes everybody feel that they do, because it's a totally kind of amazing, democratizing force where you see a zine made by a kid in Omaha sitting next to like an Ed Ruscha book, and I think it's just, there's no place else where that happens, and I think it's just remarkable that that's continued to happen for 40 years and will go way into the future. So, so I'll just say, my thanks to all of you for starting that. We're really, really grateful. So, and now, Max Schumann.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Great turnout. Yeah, thank you, all panelists, and thank you, Judson Church, and thank you, ADWSE, and thank you especially Kate and Keith for logistically setting this all up. Did a wonderful job. And we're just going to cut like really right to the chase. I'm going to give a brief introduction to everyone, to the panel here, and then we're going to take it away. And I hope that we can have a little time at the end for questions from the audience as well. So we'll try and work that in too. Okay. Starting to my right, Pat Steir is one of the founding members of the Printed Matter group, Printed Matter Inc. Pat has worked as editor for Semiotext magazine and was a founding member of both Printed Matter Bookshop and the landmark feminist journal Heresies. She has had over 300 one-person shows in galleries and museums in US, Europe, and Japan. Her work has been featured in the Venice Biennale, Documenta, the Sao Paulo Biennial, the Museum of Modern Art, Whitney Museum of American Art, Philadelphia Museum, and many others. Her work is represented in numerous public collections, including Metropolitan Museum, National Gallery of Art, Whitney Museum, the Modern, the Tate, and many others as well. So welcome, Pat. And Martha Wilson, next to our right. Martha is a pioneering feminist artist and gallery director who over the past 4 decades created innovative photographic and video works that explore her female subjectivity. She has been described by New York Times critic Holland Cotter as one of the half-dozen most important people for art in downtown Manhattan in the 1970s. In 1976, she founded Franklin Furnace, an artist-run space that champions the exploration, promotion, and preservation of artist books, temporary installation, performance art, as well as online works. She's represented by PPOW Gallery in New York and has received fellowships for performance art from National Endowment for the Arts and the New York Foundation for the Arts, Bessie and Obie Awards for commitment to artist freedom of expression, a Yoko Ono Lennon Courage Award for the Arts, a Richard Massey Foundation White Box Arts and Humanities Award, and in 2013 received an honorary degree, fine arts degree from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And Lucy Lippard is a writer, sometime curator, and activist known for her incisive identification and analysis of conceptualism, as well as feminist and political art. Lucy Lippard was a founder of Printed Matter, the Heresies Collective and Journal, the Women's Art Registry, and Political Art Documentation Distribution. For the last 2 decades, she has written primarily on place, tourism, land use, archaeology, local history, and Native American art. She received a Sackler Center First Award given by the Brooklyn Museum in recognition of extraordinary women who are first in their fields. And she was the subject of the exhibition Materializing 6 Years, Lucy Lippard and the Emergence of Conceptual Art, held at the Brooklyn Museum's Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art. Her most recent book is Undermining: A Wild Ride Through Land Use, Politics, and Art in the Changing West. For the last 19 years, she has edited a monthly community newsletter in Galisteo, New Mexico. And next, we have Mike Glier. Mike Glier, in 1975, Mike Glier received a BA from Williams College, Williamstown, Massachusetts, and then attended the Whitney Museum Independent Studies program. He received an MA from Hunter College in 1975. From 1978 to 1984, he was an active member of collaborative projects, or CoLab, and participated in the Times Square show. Between 1979 and 2000, he was engaged with Printed Matter, New York, as a staff member from 1980 to 1984, and subsequently also on the board of directors. Mike has had solo exhibitions of his drawings and paintings internationally in galleries which include the American Graffiti Gallery, Amsterdam, Rona Hoffman Gallery in Chicago, Barbara Gladstone Gallery in New York, among many others. In 1989, he was the New England recipient of Awards in Visual Arts, and in 1996, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in Painting. He is currently represented by Barbara Krakow Gallery, Boston, Gerald Peter Gallery, New York, and Santa Fe, and Jeffrey Young, Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And finally, we have Clive Phillpot. And Clive Phillpot is a writer, curator, and former art librarian. He was director of the MoMA Library from 1977 to 1994. He is well known for collecting, exhibiting, and writing about artist books. His most recent publications include Book Trek, selected essays on artist books from J.R.P. Ringier, and Nobody Knows from Bookie Wookie. You may also have seen him in the Ray Johnson documentary, How to Draw a Bunny. Thank you, and that does it for the intros. So just to get things started, I was just thinking that we would, let's just have a go around with, if people could just talk freely about your first encounter with Printed Matter and early involvement, and which will be interesting because some of the people sitting here's first encounter with Printed Matter was actually before Printed Matter existed, before even probably that name was chosen. So Pat, can you start us off?
Well, this is, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Good.
What's that?
Oh, okay, that's good, thank you. In late 1975, I was crossing a street in Genoa, Italy with Sal Lewitt, and I had been an art director in a big book company before that, and I always thought if art didn't work out for me, I'd go back to books. So I said to Sal, would you back me in a poetry book publishing company? I thought I would make my money doing that, which was kind of a dreamy thing. Anyway, he said he would back a company that published artist books, because artist books included poetry and photography and installation, and it was a broader thing, and that's what he was interested in. We then wrote a postcard to Edith Diak saying, help, how do you do this? Because we knew her from Art Right magazine. She sent invitations to Robin White, Irena Van Zaan, Walter Robinson, and I think to Lucy, got a postcard from her. When we came back, Sal spoke to Lucy and to Mimi Wheeler about joining. He spoke personally to them, but he spoke to invite them and ask them to collaborate, which they did do. So that's my memory of how it started. We then decided, then we had there was a board. Nobody was the head of the board. The board had no head of the board that I remember, although because they were natural leaders, Saul and Lucy became the head of the board. But we never nominated or voted, but we let the natural leaders lead, why not? Mimi Wheeler and I spent 2 years doing paste ups for books. We designed some the artist designed, and some we hired a freelance
And that's
designer.
of that group of publications that Printed Matter put out between 1976 and 1978,
Yeah.
that includes
There's
the,
a list. I brought the list.
yeah, Michelle's, yeah.
Yeah, it was Douglas Hubler, Ellen Lanyon, Martha Rossler, Michelle Stewart, Eve Sonneman. My favorite book for the way it looks, and it took us years to do it, Guerrilla Art Action Group, the gag book. It's a beautifully, we had a freelancer to help design it. It's a beautiful, Kathy Acker was co-publication with TVRT Press, John Gibson, Snapshots by Mary Bodonowitz, and Ann Scales Postcards. And so those were the 10 books that we really spent our life
Right,
pasting up. We pasted them up by hand, no computers yet.
right. Martha, what's in the Printed Matter, in the exhibition at ADWSC, there's the earliest letterhead that I can find with the name Printed Matter on it is 112 Franklin Street, which would become Franklin Furnace. And I know that in early board minutes with the Printed Matter group that included Pat, Lucy, and Mimi, and I think Robin and some others, there's reference where they identify somewhere in the meeting notes, it's like, hey, there's Martha Wilson's out there, she's interested in artist books also. Can you talk about your early collaboration with Printed Matter and clarify that early space, Printed Matter at Franklin Furnace? There's another letterhead that says Franklin Furnace Bookstore on it that says, we also have a working group here called Printed Matter. So please elaborate or explain. Thank you.
It was a very confusing time. I am an artist. I took my publications to the Museum of Modern Art bookstore and said, look, you had the information show here in 1970. Why don't you distribute my books? And they said, look, lady, your book costs $5, but it would cost us $5 to do the bookkeeping to keep track of your $5. So we're not going to distribute your books. So there was a vacuum in the art world, especially in the downtown art scene, because everybody was making these publications. And I think we were in touch because we all wanted to service a new field that hadn't really been acknowledged or defined yet. We didn't even have the term artist books. We called them book-like works by artists for a while, and we just didn't know what to call it exactly. So, but Martha, being a solo person, was able to incorporate more quickly than Printed Matter, which was a collective of 12 people in the end. There were more people involved in the consensus process, took a little bit longer. So I was in business. I opened my doors. Franklin Furnace opened its doors on April 3rd. By June, we had had several meetings, and actually Mimi Wheeler, thank you for helping me send out that mail. In those days, you had to print the letter, fold it into the envelope, take the bulk mail down to the post office, and Mimi helped me to do that. The mailing list was stolen from another not-for-profit organization that shall remain nameless right now, but we'll we can talk about that later, too. And I think the plan was really good, that we were going to collaborate on space and have printed matter and Franklin Furnace existing at 112 Franklin Street in the storefront until Willoughby Sharp's lawyer, Bob Projansky, came downstairs and started yelling, "This will never be known as the Printed Matter Building!" It kind of put an end to the discussion. So we had a further discussion about how maybe the for-profit activities of publishing and distribution could be taken on by printed matter, and the not-for-profit activities of exhibition and archiving could be taken on by Franklin Furnace, and that's how it ended up.
Yeah, so we sort of split it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because so Martha did the archive, and we were supposed to be publishers. Ha! That didn't last long. I mean, we were not business savvy enough and so on. Well, I never got a postcard, but I remember Saul coming over and sitting me down on the loft and saying that he was tired of having his dealers hand out his artist books, which he considered as important a work as any other work he was doing, and that he wanted to see them get some respect, so we should do something about that and start this thing and so forth. And then we called in Edit Dayak and Mike Robinson because they were doing art right, and that made sense because they were sort of the kind of funky thing that we wanted to identify with. We didn't want slick books or dealers' books at all. And then it started, and it went on and on. I was never head of the board, believe me. I had very little to do with any of the sort of day-to-day stuff because I have no head for business whatsoever, but I had a lot of opinions, and I certainly had a lot to do with which books were published. I mean, we're all yelling and deciding which books to be published and so forth, but the first batch was very, very exciting. I think Michelle Stewart's was actually the first one that came out, aside from the Martha thing, so. But anyway, that's what I remember. And the dream that we had, which I'm always talking about, is that we saw it as a way of helping artists, as service to artists who were making artist books. And there were more, of course, Ed Ruscha had already made artist books. I mean, it wasn't like we'd never heard of these things before. I don't remember when the term came up, do you?
I don't either.
Anyway.
Who coined it, you know?
I have no idea.
Artist books.
Yeah.
Who?
It was the show at Moore College in Philadelphia.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, in
that's
72,
right.
73.
Yeah.
Okay, well then it was already did
With
exist.
a great
then.
essay by John Perot, which really helped define the field.
Huh.
I think that sounds right.
But we had the idea was that these would be mass-produced. They were not book objects. They were mass-produced things. They were supposed to be cheap and easily distributed, and they were supposed to be popular. And so they were supposed to be in drugstores and airports, and this was a way of getting art out to the broader audience, which has always been one of my totally unsuccessful goals. And the whole thing.
Utopian thinking is always dangerous.
Yeah. So anyway, go.
So I got a email yesterday from Max that said, Mike Glier, tell a story about boots on the ground. What was it like working in the store at Printed Matter? So in the early 80s, Manhattan was less safe. I was mugged 3 times and I witnessed a murder. Printed Matter was on Lippard Street, just below Noisy Canal. The store had 2 big windows at ground level which faced south, letting direct light into the store at midday. To the right of the windows and up a step was the entrance. In the morning, one had to mind fingers when opening the metal gate with a diamond pattern that scissored shut when it collapsed. And Nancy Lynn, who's here, often struggled with that gate. I had to come in sometimes and rescue her. The books were displayed in wooden card racks that you might have found in a drugstore in the 1960s. In high art tradition, the walls were painted white. But as the 80s rolled on, we realized that it was our business to challenge high art traditions, so we painted the walls a buoyant tropical blue. In the staff area at the desk with the view of the sales floor sat Nancy Princenthal, who became a much admired editor, a much admired art writer, and behind her at the director's desk sat Ingrid Sishi, who later became the editor of Art Forum. To the right of Ingrid, in a dogleg of space, I stood at a table wrapping books. The inventory was behind the 3 of us in a separate room that was lined with metal shelves and lit with overhead fluorescence. Since the books were wildly different shapes and few had spines sturdy enough to stand up, The stock rested flat in brown cardboard boxes. To complete an order, the manager handed me an invoice. I searched the boxes, wrapped the books, and took them to the Canal Street post office to stand in line and contemplate eternity.
Which was next door.
It was next door. This work was not glamorous, so I took to eating liverwurst, onion, and mustard sandwiches to add flavor to the day.
I first got to printed matter in 1977. I'd been invited to come to New York, and it was the very first time at Easter, 77, to interview for the job of director of the library at Museum of Modern Art. But I'd already heard a lot about printed matter and a lot about Franklin Furnace. So I went to both these establishments. The end of the week I was at MoMA, and remember being greeted by this incredible Alsatian. What's the US term for Alsatian? What was that? German Shepherd, that's right. Similar, but it's the same dog. And these glistening teeth greeted me at Franklin Furnace. But I managed to get in and talk to Martha and get an idea what was going on and get some literature. And I've only just tonight figured out where I went after that. Thanks to Max's show and Max's interpretation of it, it was some light-filled space with glassy light windows and some sort of steel or metal supports for books. And we just established this in the Artist Space building. I could never figure out quite where I was because I was a bit disoriented anyway. But just to say the first time I got there, but can I finish with the other story, which is my first time on the board, which ends this discussion puts it into a new phase, I think. Because I was asked, by this time I'd written several things in American as opposed into English, and become quite known working with Lucy on pad, with Sol doing a series of books for Art Journal, and Ingrid by that time at Art Forum on Artist Magazine. So I'd got some sort of track record here, instead of someone who just wandered across the ocean. And at my first board meeting, Sol was there, which was a great delight. I first met him when I got to MoMA because he had his retrospective. So this was an ongoing thing in a way. Lucy, again, great pleasure to actually be working with her, although I'd already begun to work with her with pad. Carol, later to be Carol Lewitt, Ingrid Sishi, Edith Ack, Robin White, Amy Baker, Pat, of course, and also Nancy, Nan, and Mike, who might have been working for the store, but they were pretty much the same as board members, really. We all contributed. And I came with Haldina Pindell, who was my friend at Museum of Modern Art. And of the two of us, she decided not to go any further, and I decided this is exactly where I wanted to be. So what I would end this little photo of this board meeting together in Jenny Holtz's loft, where a part of town I hadn't quite been before, even though I'd moved to the Lower East Side at one point. And so the new board was constituted, but the first thing that happened, Sol and Lucy buggered off, left us all to carry the can. So it was so disappointing. I was just looking forward to working with them on the board, and it was up to us, so to speak, to carry on. So this was the next generation, I guess, with some of the older generation. Thank you.
So you were like you were on the kind of like second generation of board of directors.
It seems to fit in the narrative,
Like
and I think that's
transition
more or
period.
less true.
Right. Yeah, but before we do that, I want to ask you about, and you and Lucy, about, so when Printed Matter started, it started really with a publishing program, though there's this letter that's dated December 1975, before Printed Matter is even named, that is a solicitation to artists to make proposals for publishing projects, but also to tell us about books that you've already published. But I wonder, I'm very curious about how you reached out and identified artists who were producing books at that time, 75, 76. It seems like there is geographic diversity representation, and when you look at the body, those works that Pat those bookworks that Pat read off, it's actually a remarkable range of different stylistic, there's a photography book, there's a graphic book, the Ellen Lanyon book, there's the Douglas Hubler conceptual textbook, there's a whole range. There's found photography by Michelle Stewart before
almost
that
whole
popular.
list we asked. I think one or more of us knew those people had books.
Mm-hmm.
And when I wrote my letter to artists, I got a list of artists from the not-for-profit that shall remain nameless, and just wrote to everybody and said, I bet you have these books under your bed, and you don't know what to do with them.
Right.
Yeah.
But were you aware of kind of like pockets of activity happening
Yes,
around the
yes.
country and abroad and stuff
And
like
abroad.
that?
Yes, because
But
all
some of them came from other places too, because Mary Jean Kenton, she had a pseudonym. I mean, I didn't even know who she was. That came in just out of the clear blue sky, and I don't remember quite how.
I think because nobody was doing that, word of mouth was good. People,
Yeah, but she was not even from New York, I don't think.
I know,
I
but-
met her once. I mean, she's sort of a mystery woman, but did you know her?
No.
And there was the something of Mary Jane Scales or Mary.
yeah, that
Yeah,
little list.
and Scales.
Ann Scales, yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought Ann Scales was the artist, and then it turned out to be this person who was just out there. It was fun. So we must have done a fair amount of outreach through word of mouth.
Through
probably,
word of
Right.
mouth and through
Yeah.
people who we knew who had books. And
Yeah.
on that list, I think we knew everybody. One of us knew
But
every
did
one of
you,
them.
was that selection chosen out of a broader pool of proposals?
I
Do
think
you
that was
remember?
the proposals, the first list of proposals, and then we stopped because we didn't know we could do it.
Right, so you invited those people specifically?
Yeah, or we invited them, or they contacted us
Right,
because we had invited a friend who told us. But some of the people I know personally, we asked, like the Guerrilla Art Action, we knew they had something.
Yeah, I'd been working with them for years,
Yeah,
and Michelle
yeah.
was a close friend,
Yeah.
and Ellen lived underneath me. And so
Yeah,
Right.
so a lot of them, we just knew. Doug Hoover I taught with at Cal Arts, and she was a friend probably of Lucy and Sal's. I mean, we knew these people for
right.
the most part.
But also, let's mention Seth Siegelov's artist books, his artists, and that's because that all happened before
It's the
printed
same.
matter.
Well,
And he was
before
already
us.
well into, he'd
Yeah,
gone and
yeah,
lived in Paris
yeah,
by
yeah.
then and was publishing Marxist books. But Larry Wiener's and Bob Barry's and various people's, and the Xerox book and all of those things were really a precedent. And since I was close to Seth, that was a precedent for me to think about. And so was Saul, of course.
And Ruchet had nearly finished. Ruchet had nearly finished.
Had basically finished his initial output of
Yeah.
artist books, yeah.
But after, I think, we were for profit, I think, until Ingrid, or for no profit, until Ingrid started to run the space. We had one salaried person. At first, it was Irena von Zahn. That was the one person who got paid. And then later, we had Mike and other people. We actually paid them, although the money came from Sal's pocket because we weren't selling anything. Ingrid wrote a brilliant letter to the IRS, a brilliant proposal, that we had trouble getting a not-for-profit because we were a store
Right,
and we were selling books. And in her brilliant proposal to the IRS, she said, well, theaters sell tickets and are not-for-profit, such as the kitchen and dance space and so forth are all not-for-profit, and they're selling tickets. So books are like a performance for shut-ins and should be
Right.
non-for-profit. And they bought it, and we became not-for-profit. I think it was after we were in business for 2 years.
In the exhibition, we actually have a full documentation of that epic struggle because in the very beginning of it, there's a letter from Artist Space that acted as the nonprofit umbrella for the application for 501c3. And then after we have the application, there's like a please clarify letter from the IRS saying, excuse me, you're a bookstore, how are you a nonprofit? And then there's this careful clarification that was written, I believe, maybe by Printed Matter's lawyer at the time, volunteer lawyer, and then there was a flat rejection from IRS. Sorry, it doesn't cut it, no nonprofit status. And then there's this very careful rebuttal, and then finally the granting of nonprofit. So it's this epic narrative that's
And I
played
think that
out.
was 2 years later.
It was in 78 that
Yeah,
it got
yeah.
granted, yeah.
So for, for 2 years, and now I think that they sell the books.
But my question about those was was the idea to be profit with the ideal, like I think that I see reference in some of Lucy's writing from about that time, of artist books being this viable, independent economy, completely separate and outside of kind of gallery, market, art considerations. That was the goal, right? Do you want to talk further about that? I'd be curious to hear.
No, I mean, that seems, it was part of this whole, kind of lefty attempt to bypass the art world, bypass the which Seth Siegelob, again, should get some of the credit for, because he took a bunch of artists and he thought, he wasn't going to wait till they had a gallery, then they had somebody wrote about them, then they get into a museum show, and then finally you make it. And so he just bypassed that whole thing by publishing pieces, artist books that were actually exhibitions, because that started a whole tradition of book as exhibition or exhibition as book or whatever, which was another really interesting offshoot of the whole artist book. Because once you got the idea of an artist book, you could really make it do anything. So that was an important moment. So we did see it. That's a nice way of putting it. It's a different economy, yeah.
And then came to the grim reality check that it's just not possible.
Yeah.
Well,
There was such crazy hopefulness about this whole thing. It was kind of insane to take anything that came in the door and try to market it, and the staff had no business experience or marketing experience. We were all artists. So, it was kind of insane, but it's the hopefulness of printed matter that I think is so special. And it's kind of founded on that idea. And, for artists, I think, anybody can walk in and give your product to it, and you have that hope that somebody someplace is going to look at it, and you're going to communicate with somebody, and that's what we do it for, right?
Yeah.
And printed matter just offers this for anybody who wants it, And the other thing I find so moving about printed matter is its glorious futility, in that, a lot of the books aren't that good. A lot of the books are great. There's a lot of variety there, but it is moving to me, and it always has been, that so many people want to contribute and be a part of this thing, artist books, and regardless of the quality of the product. And I just really love that about it.
even if selling it is futile, getting it out is not, because the galleries were giving them away before we found a way to sell them.
Yeah. But that was the point. But most people didn't have a gallery who would give them away, so they were just no place to put the things in.
Well, I know that Lucy, there's an essay that you wrote, I think, that came out. I know it's I don't know where it first came out, but it's in Joan Lyons' Artist Books Critical Anthology. That kind of, the first place I see that you're often quoted and referenced, kind of statement about artist books being available in newsstands and supermarkets and things like that. And then you did a follow-up essay around 78 that's also in Critical Anthology that's very pessimistic and says, well, the problem with artist books is that they are art and they are accessible only to an educated public and stuff. So.
Well, this all kind of came out of conceptualism and the idea that conceptual art was going to be able to bypass the institutions. And then when conceptual artists, who were friends of mine, I was glad to see them successful, but they started making it and becoming just as much of a commodity as anybody else. I mean, Saul already was, not that he was dying to be or whatever, but he and Saul's name was so important on this. He thought of the name, didn't he, Brendan Benner? Yeah.
I always thought it was you.
Oh, no, I think it was Saul.
Got it just right.
No, I think...
And Clive, when I came to Printed Matter in 1989, and when I came there, you were on the board of directors, but you also would come on these regular library visits for a MoMA, going through all of Printed Matter's accepted books and take a very large portion of them for the MoMA collection. And that actually continues to this day with, subsequent generations after Janice Ekdahl and now David Sr. come down and review Printed Matter's inventory of the ones that are not commercially distributed and take a large portion. Can you talk about the MoMA's artist book collection and your
Well, I
part in its
discovered a little while
development?
ago that I started buying books from MoMA within a couple of weeks of getting here.
So right away.
And I've written this in some other context about believing I had an unwritten agreement that I would make an artist book collection. Nobody's told me to, I just did it. And printed matter was the vital part of that. That brought me the new material. And it developed in time that there would be a shelf of printed matter for MoMA, chosen not with MoMA in mind, but I think in terms of the quality of the material, and sometimes the lack of quality of the material. And New York Public Library had another place on the shelf, and other institutions I'm sure you worked on. And I would go through those, and if it was 2 sheets stapled together, I think this doesn't look like a book, but on the other hand, we could use it in another context, and I take it anyway. But so I could discriminate some things for the collection that was devoted to the books as art, and other information and art which would go somewhere else in the files at MoMA. So I would take a lot of, if not 90%, 95% of what you put out, and it saved me going through the shelves to see what was new and what was old. And I've often said that the Museum of Modern Art's collection of artist books is almost like an archive of your inventory, because so much of it ended up there.
Right.
But we didn't always, I mean, we started out with the idea of taking everything, which was really
Right.
a nice idea. But I remember real controversies with people whose books we didn't take. And I don't know what the hell criteria we used.
Can I,
I think we said, I liked it.
Yeah, I didn't like it, yeah.
Well, there's in the,
Whoever yelled loudest.
but can I mention the other criterion, which I think was very important, that you wouldn't take anything with less than 100, edition of 100.
right.
That suggested someone was
Yeah.
quite serious and not just vanity press kind of stuff. And they were committed to replicating their material, their information. I think that was very important, and I adopted the same thing at MoMA straight away.
But didn't it also work to kind of discourage people who were doing more book arts, limited deluxe editions?
Yeah.
Well,
and
that's
things
probably
like
part
that?
of, for me, that's part of the message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we left out, I think printed matter is kind of, has much more eclectic definition now, but we didn't want there couldn't be a text by anybody else. It
Right.
had to be
Right.
totally, I mean, it couldn't be a catalog, even if it was a really gorgeous catalog or had a lot of artworks or
Or-
projects or whatever.
Or an illustrated book in that tradition.
Yeah, or an illustrated book, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because even though stuff does slip in and stuff like that, we are still very much guided, I think, by a lot of those founding principles, is that it needs to be the primary projects, the project itself in
But
book
despite
form.
all that, the point of it was open to ideas, open to art.
Yeah.
It was so important that the stuff there just was not discriminated against in any way whatsoever, except the quantity in it.
Yes, except our taste.
Yeah. And maybe a little taste, but not much.
Can I mention the windows while I'm at it?
Yes.
Because also I want to, when we
in the
moved,
background.
when it moved to Worcester Street, when Dia took us under their wing and then kicked us out from under their wing, at least that's the way I understood how that went on, but Julie Alt did the windows after I did, but this batch of windows at Lippard Street was really fun to do, and the idea was not, I mean, I think it was the first sort of, at least among the first window art that didn't say, come in and buy something. I mean, it said printed matter, artist books, but the windows were, as you can see from these terrible slides, or the terrible dark wall or whatever, but were very eclectic. And the idea was that they were supposed to be socially and politically oriented. And I was amazed to see a letter from me in the show that says to somebody who wasn't political enough for me, and I told him, go somewhere else.
Rejected,
I suggested other venues. I was very nice.
But I don't know
about
if
it.
if you also saw on the show, there's a letter, I think it's something that you and Nancy Lynn both collaborated on, but Printed Matter had made an application to a grant from a very small, modest grant in support of the window installation program, and it was rejected on the basis that you did not do opening receptions for the windows. And then Nancy and Lucy wrote back very stridently saying, like, excuse me, but this is not for fancy art world people. This is a project for the general public and for the people who work at the post office and the people, the working class people who pass by our store on a daily basis.
And then, of course, Aldrich Serrano did a piece with Leon as Pope, Leon Golub as the Pope. And the neighbors objected to this. Our broader public did not like this. And so we turned it to the inside. And
so you
that, of
know.
course, got people into the store because we put censored, you have to come inside to see this, and everybody rushed in.
That old trick.
I wanted to ask Mike about as a printed matter employee. I was actually at the exhibit earlier with him and was asking about who did the design. Printed matter used to have an advertising budget. We don't have an advertising budget now. But back in the early days, there's all these amazing ads that came out in art magazines, but also Village Voice and Soho Weekly News and some other Tribeca community newspaper. And often they actually included order forms on them so people could make their orders directly out of the magazines. But they all have these really interesting designs, and I recognize Mike's handwriting in some of them. And I know that like some of the catalogs were done, a lot of them were done in-house. Some of them, Peter Downsborough did a cover of one of the really early ones. He used to work at Printed Matter. But can you talk about the artist, kind of the artist staff of Printed Matter back in that 1980 period, early 80s period?
And vigilance.
Yeah. I don't know quite. I was going to go with something slightly different for that, but I think it's related. There were, because of the conceptual moment, a lot of artists were thinking about alternate distribution methods for artworks. Printed matter was one of the core places for that kind of thinking. But there were other groups like collaborative projects that I was involved in, then group material that came a little later, that were also really interested in thinking how artists could get their work out, not through galleries, but through alternative methods. So at Printed Matter, one of the things Nancy Lynn and I worked on was something called Art Direct, which we actually sold artists multiples by mail order, and we made a little catalog. As I said, none of us were experienced in marketing or business at all, and so our advertising was like, oh yeah, people advertise and they have a business, let's do it. I mean, it was not very sophisticated when we think back on it. But Art Direct, CoLab had been doing pop-up Christmas stores in November and December and showing inexpensive artist multiples. And so we wrote a grant. We got a grant from the NEA, I think, to do this little flyer that we sent out a lot, like 20,000, I'm going to say, a lot of flyers around with these crazy multiples. One was stolen purses. Each one was different. Another was Tom Modernist did sex sculptures of the Zodiac, and I mean they were nutty. And but Printed Matter was tried to figure out how they could support artists through mass distribution and mail order, which was kind of a new idea. Senator Proxmire, who was famous for publishing his yearly list of the worst projects sponsored by taxpayers' dollars, mentioned our catalog as one of the worst.
Can I emphasize the documentation that came out of Printed Matter? The little catalogs at the beginning were precise, well-designed, communicative,
And descriptive.
Proper, yeah, and the descriptions, the work involved in that is extraordinary. Then you work your way up suddenly to Mike's, I think of them as Mike's catalogs, where you've got a typical American family with 2.1 children on the front cover and a basketball team on the back cover, but it's half an inch thick, loaded with artist books. This made the point more than anything else, coming through the mail. Look what artist books have become. Yeah. And the presentation was terrific. No particular slant on it, like this is it, it's happening. And incredibly useful retrospectively, I should say.
Well, also back to Franklin Furnace, Mike and I did a show called Vigilance of artist books at Franklin Furnace. This interests me in particular now, partly because they just redid it. At where?
Artist Space.
Artist Space, that's right. Yeah. But also because I'm trying to put together some kind of artist book show for the Museum of Art, New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. And it's very difficult to show the things. I mean, Clive has done a great job constantly, but you have to have the money to buy 2 copies if you leave one out. I would just assume, have you had trouble with people boosting them from the Washington Square show?
Oh, boosting stuff from I think we're pretty good there. The 10th Avenue location, I don't think we're doing too good.
But I mean, it is definitely a problem. But what we did in Vigilance, we had a bunch of card tables. Mike did this with his famous lettering. the Gramsci quote, a huge banner of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, my favorite quote in the world. But anyway, and then we had card tables, and each one had a little centerpiece, sort of vaguely related to the subject, right? And then the books were tied to the legs of the card table.
I
Yeah,
think it
yeah,
was
with
chain. It was like really.
Yeah. Chaining books has come back.
Wasn't there a component of that exhibit that was in I know that that nice news, the beautiful newsprint tabloid kind of catalog for the exhibit also has a printed matter mail order catalog as part of it, and then also has something at MoMA. Do you remember what the component of
I was
the
surprised
MoMA
to see
visual
it
is?
on the walls of the exhibition, but I vaguely remember. It's a printed art show by Reva Castleman, which was a very lively show, but prefigured Debbie Wise' show
Right.
later,
Committed
which
to
was
Print.
really something, Committed to Print.
Yeah.
But it was a good show by Reva Castleman, and this must have been there, and I'd forgotten it.
You know, while we're talking about design, I was trying to think about Printed Matter's legacy in New York, and and I'd be curious about if some of the other panel members might talk about this a little bit. I think Printed Matter has its own kind of graphic sensibility that has been pretty consistent from the beginning, and I think it's because it has to represent so many artists and so many products. It can't have a clarity of design. It has to somehow be busy. I mean, when you walk in the store, it's like being in the forest with a whole lot of leaves, you know? There's too much to see.
Yeah.
You kind of have to squint, blur your eyes, and take it all in, kind of like a texture.
You all come back now?
But when the new space happens,
Yeah.
it's going to be different.
Yeah.
But is that good?
What's that? No, we're going to fill that new space up really fast. It's about twice a square footage, so it's going to be substantially bigger with really nice high ceilings and stuff. But we have so much stuff. We have 4 to 5 storage units filled
But
with
if you
stuff
look at
as
the
well.
front of Printed Matter now, you let all that debris accumulate on the facade. There's all these stickers and stuff, and it's peeling.
Oh yeah, it's our sticker-free zone.
That's great.
But I think it's, Printed Matter's done that for a really long time, that kind of texture. It's overload of stuff.
Right.
And when you think about New York and the art scene, it gets so clean and glossy, Printed Matter has just never gone that way.
Right.
And,
No, we're gonna. It will not be pristine, and it'll be fun and homey.
Can I ask a question?
But it'll be more comfortable for you, the public, for us, the staff, and for the books, which is the most important thing. Because right now it's just, if you've
So
been to 10th
overwhelming,
Avenue,
yeah.
it's just too crowded. There's not room for any of us. So.
Do you ever send, when books have been sitting there for 10 years, do you send them back? What's the time limit? Is there a time limit?
It's such a long, lengthy process. We do it every several years, but there's so many different steps. There's the address verification of books that you've carried for literally 4 decades, and these people might not be living in the same place, let alone even alive sometimes. And so it's like verifying that they actually are still out there, and then there's waiting to hear back from them, making sure everyone is all paid up, that you are, that everything is right, and then you send them back, that it just takes so long. We need to do it. In the show, there's a great form letter. We have a little section on the title selection policy, which shows different variations and kind of internal critiques that Printed Matter, evaluations that Printed Matter went through, deciding, do we carry audio, do we carry video, do we carry out-of-print books or some signed and numbered editions, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's this discontinue letter that is a form letter that says, Dear artist, sorry, but your book has not been selling very well, so therefore we're going to return it. What we'd like to do is donate 3 copies to Franklin Furnace and then donate the rest through the mail, and then send the rest by the mail back to you. Or is there something else you want to do? And the person underlines something else with an arrow and then says, please take my books. I would like you to do something else. Please take my books, put them in a pot, and burn them. Then take the ashes and put them in an envelope and mail them back to me, and we'll consider it a mail art project. Thank you very much. Anyway, it's agonizing, but it has to be done from time to time. Anyway, sorry.
Well, other publishers and distributors say, we're going to burn the books unless you want to buy them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one was offering to burn
Can
them
I
themselves.
ask a question,
That's
Max?
good.
I was going to say, hearing about the stickers on 10th Avenue, is it? I can't remember which avenue it is. But did the Printed Matter lose something when it left Lisbonard Street, south of Houston, and went north to Worcester Street? It seemed to me it was a very different phenomenon for a while. But
Yes.
somehow, back on 10, the stickers on the outside begin to suggest it's sort of part of the community in a way that Worcester never was. Perhaps I am misinterpreting that.
Going back to our roots.
Right, yeah.
Well, and when you see the first when you see again in the exhibit, which you have to go see, but tomorrow, is when it moves to Worcester Street, it becomes Printed Matter Bookstore at Dia because of this relationship we had with Dia. Bruce Mao, the well-regarded designer, very popular at that time especially, did all of our letterhead and stationery and the spiffy new, I don't know if it was the first time ever, business cards. And so everyone got their fancy Bruce Mao design. There was a very slick look, and the store was pretty pristine. But then once John left and whatever, the kids took over, it got funky again. It got funky before he
But I
moved to
still think it's
Chelsea.
a very important moment in the history, that transition from south of the street to north of the street.
But Clive, it was a moment, you know, it was a highly political art moment. And
In what sense?
it was a hopeful moment for us because we were all young. And
Not
we were
then.
all, we were young then and politically involved and
But was it a poisoned kiss from Deer?
what?
Never mind.
I don't.
I mean,
was
lesbian
saying-
art is like, for me, when I remember Lesbian Art Street and Hudson Street, it's like when I remember high school. It's, you know, the beginning of something very hopeful. And
So what went with that move? Was it more sense of being a business, do you think, or?
I don't remember what, I wasn't that involved at that point. I don't remember what exactly went down. Do
I
you?
lived upstairs, so I was still involved. But
I think it was back to that idea of
I
trying to
don't
make
think it became more businesslike, only the look. It had a new dress, but it was
Yeah.
the same funky,
There's still a lot of funky stuff in it.
Yeah,
Yes.
The move to Chelsea was an effort to attach the bookstore to the art community that was burgeoning in Chelsea and presumably buying stuff. And
Yeah. I mean, that's something, that's a major feature of Printed Matter, I think, is a duality between offering an independent, autonomous, circumventing kind of model for production and distribution, but at the same time, to be honest, we are part of the art world, and our audience is part of the art world, and we're dependent on that. I think that with the astounding kind of growth and success of the art fairs that we put on now in New York and LA that have reached rock concert, proportions, is we're actually, I'm saying that the Lucy's vision of reaching audiences beyond the art-educated audience is really palpable as you see it, is the diversity of people who come to the things. It's not just art world people who come to those fairs. So I think we're still working on that principal vision. It's still achievable. It's still worth.
Well, there's
working
still a lot of
towards.
art that's trying to do that, is balancing between populist, I don't mean right-wing populism, I mean actual populism. And,
Real populism.
Jim Hightower populism, and the need to make a living. I mean, this is where all of us still are, this trapped in the art world,
And
like
there's
it or not. I mean,
I want to ask you if it's been, have you had some of the audience from the Paula Cooper bookstore across the street? Do people wander between the two bookstores?
There's
Are they very-
yeah, definitely. You
Yeah.
see people going back and forth and stuff.
Yeah.
We've done a few collaborations over the years, but not that many. We probably should have done more, but yeah, no, it's nice to be in a community of two bookstores.
Well, bookstores are rare now.
Yeah, I know.
This idea that started with Printed Matter of getting artist books in grocery stores and it being a really mass distributed kind of artwork was picked up by Group Material. They made a publication called Inserts, and they invited, and they were very influenced by Printed Matter. They invited, I think, a dozen artists to make a page, and then they raised money to put inserts in the New York Sunday Times, and it was distributed to millions of people. So I think that was a successful kind of artwork that took this Printed Matter idea and actually
But
realized
hadn't
it.
Hans Hacke and Joseph Bassuth and various people done that kind of insert thing before? I think Steve Kaltenbach did too.
Did they?
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it wasn't a brand new idea, but it was.
What were
it was
those
a good
instances?
one.
Do you
Yeah.
remember?
But I don't think in the Times, I don't think we could ever afford, any of the rest of them could afford the Times.
But that also puts the kind of, like when in artist book speak, when you talk about large editions being 500 or 1,000 or 2,000, relative to commercial publishing industry, that's actually really minuscule edition sizes. But a project like that goes into every single is done in the tens of thousands and is one of those rare examples of an artist book project that actually is relative to commercial distribution.
Can I suggest it's not an artist book project, but an artist publication project? The language seems to have changed now. You're talking about artist publications because they're so diverse. And the artist book is a minority of this mass of publications. It includes magazines, includes inserts, whatever you like that's printed. But the artist book is not quite as dominant now, I think, and it's not presented so dominantly either.
Wait, the artist book is not what?
Well, it was the main focus of nearly all this activity around the book from the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. But I think now if you get to an artist publication exhibit, you'll find so much more diverse.
It suddenly went off.
Is this one working? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it seems to me that the artist book as an artwork is on the decrease in a sense, apart from the book objects and unique books, which are self-evidently art, whereas the subtle and subversive books that are artist books seem to be getting a lean time when so many mongrels exist that were hybrids, magazines, and other kinds of printed material.
Well, here's to the mongrels.
So you make a real Clive, you make a real differentiation between, I mean, for me, I like going back to the term artist book and conceiving of, or just the idea of I use publication, artist publication as kind of a broader term. Artist publication could be, multiples, magazines, editions, and posters and things like that. And then the artist book to me just says that it has some kind of book-like quality to it. But do you see those as two distinct areas as opposed to one being an umbrella that artist books reside within?
One pool of publication.
Right.
And in the middle of that are some artworks.
Could we also I'd like to ask about the line grants. Didn't Printed Matter fund grants for artists to publish, to propose? And
But what was, I know it wasn't, were you involved in line? Andrea Callard
No.
and...
only
and-
insofar as the artists
Ma-
always need money to publish their stuff, and so I would recommend they apply.
Right. But there is literature and different ephemera in our archive. I think some of it's in the show. There's at least one reference to Line. But Line was like a granting organization to support artists' publishing projects back in the mid-'70s, right? And I think that Andrea Callard from CoLab was involved in that, and I'm not sure who else, but I see references to it in Printed Matter saying, by the way, Printed Matter did get a grant, well, supported by the Warhol Foundation. We actually did do a 3-year artist publishing a grant project where we gave grants to artists for publishing things, which was awesome, and then we lost the funding. But that's something we want to get more involved in is in support of the production of this stuff as well as the
Well, I think
distribution
of when
and stuff.
PAD we published PAD, well, first thing, PAD, political art documentation, and then later / distribution, started at Printed Matter. We had all our meetings at Printed Matter, and then we went to Franklin Furnace for our second Sundays. So it was a family affair. But what was I going to say about? So PAD published a now and then magazine artist publication called Up Front, which was, and then we published something called Red Letter Days every month, which was a list of socially conscious shows that were going on at the time. And Judith Goldberg, I can't remember, terrible. Sorry, Judith, if you're here, I can't remember your last name. But anyway, she and I put this sheet out and then we circled it in red with a magic marker every month. We sat down and did our little circles of magic markers. But anyway, somebody called us from the NEA and said, apply for a grant for Up Front because you'll get it. We're for you. So, I mean, it's a pain in the ass, and it's not something I never apply for grants because it's just too hard. But anyway, so a couple of us got together and applied for this grant, and we got it. The panel okayed it and so on. And then Frank Hodsell, who was the head of the NEA at that point, vetoed it. Yeah. So that was the last time grants were applied for because it was too political. But Clive named PAD, by the way, like launching pad.
Can you talk more, Lucy, about, I'm curious about, or just to hear a characterization or description of the different other activities that would happen at Printed Matter? I know that you said PAD, it was a meeting place for PAD. Didn't also the Heresies Collective, were there other, or Mike, did CoLab ever use it as a meeting point, or?
I don't think Heresies ever
never did meet there?
No,
Oh,
no.
okay.
I mean, there was a lot of close ties because Pat and I were both in Heresies.
But
Right.
we met at different people's lofts.
Where there was food involved.
Where there was
No, we had a lot of stuff at AIR too. We had the open meeting after
Right.
every issue so that the community could get up and bitch and whine about everything we do. And those tended to be at AIR. I think there was one
Yeah.
for drawings.
There weren't book signings, because that was rather against the spirit of the artist's book. So that was a function that didn't appear.
There were
One of
not
the-
book signings back in those days, yeah.
One of the things I remember, and I think this was long after we published GAG, the Guerrilla Art Action Group book, but they did I think this was a PAD event, but they brought signed envelopes, addressed and stamped envelopes that we could all send in for our Freedom of Information Act police records.
All right,
And that was interesting. That was a good project.
right.
And Margia Kramer, who I think is here tonight, did these redacted letters from that, weren't they?
Freedom of
Yeah,
Information.
they were
Act,
Freedom of
yeah.
Information Act. So.
Yeah. Cool.
Questions?
Questions? No, this is awesome. I'm fascinated. I hope everyone else is. What time are we running?
You want to get people from the audience?
What's that, 7:45? Okay, we can go for a little while. Should we open it up for questions from the audience?
Yep.
Well, that would be fun. Do we have a mic situation? I think we have a wireless mic that Keith has in the very back. So I'll put out the call. Any questions?
Get these.
This is the first one I see right here. Is that Robert Morgan?
As I recall, there was a period where there was a certain European involvement with printed matter. And I specifically remember, I think through you, Martha, if I'm not mistaken, Caspar Koenig came to printed matter and was extremely impressed with a number of the artist's books and kept coming back and bringing them to his brother in Dusseldorf to sell at Buchhandlung, as we would call. And I felt that much of the discussion was very provincial, I think, in terms of just New York, because, in fact, European involvement, Amsterdam, for example, I know that people were coming from there and bringing the books back. So these books were getting circulated in Europe at a reasonably early stage, and it was giving a lot of publicity, I think, to the genre of the artist's book and also to the artists that were producing them. Could you comment on that?
Also South America, there were centers all over the planet that we just didn't know about in the very earliest days, but we found out about. There was a bookstore in Chicago, there was one in Los Angeles, there was other books in Amsterdam, there was Ulysses Carrion's collection.
And in Milan.
Milan.
Yeah.
It
Art
never got to
Metropole in
Milan.
Canada.
Oh yeah, Art Metropole in Canada.
In the exhibit, there's these packing slips from 76, 77 that looks like one of the initial pushes for stocking the store, and there's these large orders from Europe, from Italy, of Solowit books, Seth Seeklau books, and other things. So there definitely was outreach, and I was wondering what the relationship with other books and stuff was back in those days.
And a lot of the European artists were doing books as well, so.
I think there's a great Anglophone bubble around what happened in New York. And you've heard already how things came from other countries, and there were individual initiatives. And I think the whole phenomenon, the way it was defined and historicized and so on, was very much Anglophone for a long time. Where would you see a lot of French artist books? It seems like a vacuum in New York. And I think it's true of other cultures too. But maybe it's different now, but I don't think so.
I can't hear.
Sorry.
Franklin Furness did a show, Multiples, by Latin American artists. It was in 1985. And Fatima Burkt was the curator, and she tried to get examples from every single country in Central and South America. That network still exists, and we still get books sent to us at Franklin Furness from Bolivia.
Oh, wow. No, we had some amazing 70s Latin American books, and I'm hoping that we're going to participate in a Latin American fair soon. Anyway.
How many of those early venues outside of this country still exist?
Those artist book venues.
Yes.
Art Metropole is still around. I mean, there's a new kind of generation. I mean, Jan Vos does Bookie Wookie in Netherlands, and
Other books and so still exist.
Yes.
right
Yeah.
And
And
there's
is
several
there-
little bookshops in London. now.
in London, right?
Quite small, but very special. One of those called Book Art Bookshop, which is a catchy thing to remember, but I can't remember the names of the others offhand.
And then what is the big book, not Bookworks, is that,
Bookworks is a publisher in London
I guess that's what
Yes.
I'm thinking of.
of things on the edge of being artist books. So there's a lot of small activities. And there's more if I could think of it, I'm sure.
Well, can somebody, and not me because I'm such a Luddite, but talk about the online aspect of all of this, the electronic?
The new electronic digital publishing. Well, we did a talk a week ago about the present future of artist book and artist book publishing, and of the participants, David Senior from MoMA Library moderated it, and of the participants, Paul Chan's Badlands does both ebooks and print books. Primary Information does print books as well as reprints of classics from the 60s and 70s, as well as often a free PDF, downloadable PDF. So there's this free distribution aspect. And then Triple Canopy is a digital publishing platform that works as a periodical thing. In printed matter, we would very much, in the same way, we still have floppy disks from the 1970s in our inventory that are obviously not usable anymore, but we were carrying computer publications back in 1978 or 1979, and because we also carried artist audio and video going back to those early days. We think that we should have a relationship to digital publishing as well, and hope to kind of learn more and develop that aspect of printed matter, going forward for sure.
I'm still working.
We've been forgetting the audience.
Is that Mimi? Mimi Wheeler, take it away.
I wanted to add a few things. That the name printed matter came from, in those days at the post office, books could be sent for less through the mail as printed matter. So that's where the name printed matter came from. And also, Saul's idea was not a bookstore, not to publish books, that it was to be an international distribution company. And I think it was the fall of '75. We were in Amsterdam. Everybody was influenced by the great, by Art and Project, the
Bulletin.
the publication, the artwork that they put out. Gilbert and George had done their mail order pieces. What's his name? Richard Long had published books. Jan Dibbets. It was it was in the air artist books. Gian Enzo Speroni in Torino had, already published 5 or 6. I don't remember what they are. And so Saul started talking about, we need to distribute these books, and he bought them back. We bought back, some of the artist books. I don't remember.
And this, by the way, is Mimi Wheeler, who was on the original board.
And it was really interesting. The first summer, Arena Von Zahn and I were at Edit and Mike Robinson's, writing letters soliciting directly from these artists and galleries these books, because we had no inventory. And as Pat Steir said, the women all had a little Virginia Woolf in them, and that was the idea. Then we began to get this idea that, maybe we would publish a few books, but this was not the impetus, this was not the idea behind Printed Matter. And it's true, it was, I can't think, but those were some of the early days. That was really how it got started. And we would ask, we only had a few books. When we asked for these consignment agreements, we would only ask for like 10 books. And then Arena found these really great greeting card book contained displays. So we had something to put these irregular shaped books in. And then we curated packages of books so we could sell more than one at a time. And we did them in very classic categories such as landscapes, portraits, I don't know. But it's true, it's really amazing that, all this enthusiasm, all this idea. And we put out these wonderful catalogs. I guess Clive Phillpot, the one where they're all watching television with the artist book catalog on the table. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, but I think it's really important to try and keep as much of the history together as possible.
Can I ask you a question, Mimi?
Yes.
Is who set up the inventory system? Who set up the nuts and bolts of how the business was started? We have these card catalogs of really early inventory that's like
I'll tell you who did
26 gasoline stations, $2.50 crossed out, $4.
I'm going to tell you who did it.
Who did that?
Arena Von Zahn.
So she
was
set up the-
absolutely extraordinary at detail, at keeping track of everything. And it's really funny the way Mike Glier talked about, the job at Printed Matter. It really wasn't any different then, but Arena, she was really the glue that kept all the paperwork, all the, administrative things.
Max, do you know the number of titles you have in the store now?
15,000, it says in the
It says in the
report.
thing, yeah, it's 12 to 15,000.
Thank you.
9 to 15, 13,000, something like that.
Yeah, I just want to actually go back to the gentleman's question about the difference between European bookstores, and printed. Oh, Robert Morgan, hi, I met you way back then.
Can't see anybody from up here.
Sorry. But like Koenig's bookstore, we did send them a lot of books, but Koenig clearly curated his selection. What we were sending to Europe was kind of the books that Mimi was talking about. It was Long and LeWitt, and it was, maybe later it was Holzer, but it was kind of established artists. And Printed Matter Printed Matter was he liked your book, but I'm saying Printed Matter was, I think, different than those European bookstores in that we had this really kind of radical notion, we're going to take it all, and they really curated. So.
And again, Seth's model was part of that whole business of getting European connections.
So can we follow up and ask if the store is curated now? It's a dynamic question, that it seems to me. Is Printed Matter curated? Or is
what?
Is the bookstore content curated, or is it open? Is that the
Now.
Yes.
I noticed in the nonprofit application in '78, it's very emphatically stated that Printed Matter is completely inclusive, and that it holds the right to decline things that are blatantly racist and sexist, I think it said. But otherwise, anything that qualifies as an artist book is welcome in the store. And then I know that there were criteria and selection processes before because there was documentation about it. And then when I started from '89, in '89, John Goodwin did it by himself. He made the selection. And then eventually that expanded to kind of like a group process.
You say selection, the word selection. How much selection is there?
I would say we take roughly about 40% of what gets submitted, or 25 to 35, depending on how the weather is, so to speak.
And who does that?
Right now it's Christina and Leslie with me supporting as much as I have time to. I really want to get back into the committee. Well, a lot of the stuff disqualifies itself because it really falls outside of what we would call an artist book.
Yeah.
So there's a fair number of things that do that, but then we don't have room for everything. So we make a selection. We bring 3 people to the table, bringing in different sensibilities and stuff, and hope to have a diversity of tastes and opinions and stuff like that, and also to try to be neutral about our own maybe aesthetic proclivities and stuff, and be, if this is well executed or interestingly executed or something that we haven't seen before, then that puts it in pretty good standing. If something is redundant or just not that compelling to any one of us, then that means it's less likely to get
Can I
in.
ask you, if you had 100 publications come through the door, how many would you select to sell? What percentage?
I mean, that's roughly what we get per month is 100, and we would probably take, it's probably more than that, actually, but if it was 100, we would probably take 35 or 40. A bunch of them, 35 or 40.
35.
Like 35, 40%. Probably about 20 or 30% would be disqualified because they're poetry or they're of catalogs or conventional photo books or this and that. And then there would be,
That's 20%.
what's that?
That's 20%.
20 and 35 is
The other 20 we don't
55, which
like.
would leave 20% being rejected.
The early thing about not curating, I think we have to tie this back to Saul a little bit and his aesthetic. Saul would set up, when he's creating an artwork, he would select a set of variables, and then he'd run those variables through all the permutations, and he would show all of them as if they were equally interesting. And that was a really great thing, because it was really challenging the idea of value and hierarchy, that all these things are potentially interesting. And so, he sort of applied that to printed matter a little bit, that all these things are potentially interesting. We don't really have, let's resist judgment and see what's there. Wow. And so I think there's a conceptual aspect, not just a democratic aspect to this, the way printed matter was founded.
Huh.
Nicely said.
Any more questions? And then after that,
This is not so much a question as a remark. As a big fan of both printed matter and Franklin Furnace, I have to say that over the years, I've collected more objects from printed matter than I can imagine, and from watches by Lawrence Weiner and. And I was wondering, all the objects that you sold, were they always created by artists whose books you carried, or were they separate?
the multiples and additions
Yeah,
and things
all
like
the
that?
multiples.
Technically, well, it's beginning with the Art Direct project that Mike was involved in, where printed matter sold not only artist multiples, but artist serial works, unique serial works as well, but that where the concept was inexpensive and affordable, I think. I continued that tradition. I revived it in 1990 or 91 with my annual Giftland, where I invited artists who made books to do serial and multiple works that we sold. In the first year, I invited collab. I invited a ton of collab artists to participate. I worked with Andrea Callard, actually, the first year. And we did that for like 8, 9, 10 years. Giftland holiday show. But then most of the multiples, we need to stay focused on books. Most of the multiples and objects and things like that are either, like with someone like Lawrence Weiner, or who just has such a, he has a huge artist book production, but then he also designs his own exhibition postcards, and postcards are often kind of like ephemeral published works by him in printed form, and by extension then also the multiples have a real relationship to the artist books. Most of the editions that we carry have some relationship to artist books, either via the artist's greater body of work or through the programming that Printed Matter does, where we'll focus on an artist's book works, and then if they have other published forms that relate to those books. There's a lot of editions and multiples. We should have less, I think, sometimes. But they mostly come in via a relationship to the books, or, yeah.
Hi. I love that you guys talk about how political printed matter was in the beginning and how you guys wouldn't accept, art or installations for the windows that wasn't politically charged. I work on a biweekly art publication called Packet, biweekly, and we've been trying really hard to respond to the current political climate and reacting to what's going on. And I was just wondering, what is your take on what's going on in the world right now? And do you guys still make work that reacts to issues going around the world?
Is that for you guys should talk.
I don't make work, so I'm still.
Yes, you do. What are you talking about?
Well, actually, my last book, Undermining, was totally is about more about politics and land use than it is about art, and it was modeled after an artist's book. I mean, I designed it myself with all the pictures running parallel verbal visual narratives is my conceptual idea with that. But the text runs through the middle, the pictures run through the top, and the captions run through the bottom. Totally influenced by artist books, which nobody has ever noticed. But
Actually, I think Lucy's most amazing contribution at the moment is the Galisteo newspaper that she publishes. It's this little tiny town in the middle of the New Mexican desert, and she's writing a newsletter. This is like a world-famous art critic, right? And she does this newsletter for this little group of people to create community where she lives. It's really, really nice, and it's very political.
I'm in the 19th year now of doing this thing.
So that's what we should all be doing, creating community with our efforts.
So anyway, and Michael is doing.
I paint landscapes, but I won't go through my spiel. But global warming keeps me up at night, so that's why I turned to landscape. But anyway,
As far as, printed matter, 99.99%. I actually did the math. It is 99.99% of the books that we have are not published by us, and so basically we reflect what current generations of artists are making, and sometimes I'm a little concerned about how apolitical sometimes things seem, or how kind of like art school.
Well, I just want to say something
manufactured.
about political. Beauty is political too.
Yeah. As Mike's landscapes can attest to, totally. But in our own publishing. We revived publishing in 2002 under David Platzker, the then director of Printed Matter, and we did it partly as a way because of the changing structure of funding after the culture wars of the early 90s kind of put us at a great disadvantage to some of our nonprofit counterparts like Franklin Furnace that had honed their fundraising, skills and techniques and stuff that we were kind of like left in the dust with, I feel like. But anyway, we reapproached publishing both as a way to get operating support, programming support, and then also just to situate ourselves more proactively within the community of people engaged in artist books. But we do about 4 to 8 books a year, and of them we've done a number of books with political content. Lisa Ann Auerbach's Sweaters That Talk Back, which is knitting patterns with different political slogans on them. Fierce Pussy Collective, a series of posters that they used to wheat paste in the downtown area. It's kind of like a second generation Guerrilla Girls activist collective that you can rip out and wheat paste yourself, and people actually went ahead and did that. Mi Jin Yoon's kind of Absence, which is a kind of public sculpture negative space about the World Trade Center, which is very much in response to the ridiculous multi-gajillion dollar, Towers of Babel or whatever that they went, Freedom Towers and stuff like that. It's a different type of memorial. And then most importantly, I think, is the republication of the Guerrilla Art Action Group, GAG, which I think is an amazing historical document that is just super instructive for, current generations and Occupy Wall Street and beyond generations on kind of a really, interesting, incisive, militant, and also playful kind of, very political art practice. So yes, we do like to be politically engaged.
More questions?
Bob?
Mike?
Oh, on the screen. Richard?
Did the entire design and production. In my case, as someone who began as a writer, it was important that I did the design and production as well, to make it accepted to simple matter, to printed matter. However, I'm glad to see that Clive is using the term book art rather than artist books, which I always objected to as being an autobiographical or biographical category rather than aesthetic category. And because I came out of some other tradition. Thank you.
You and I both invented that term at different times.
Yeah, thank you, Clive. Yeah. But again, the important principle was one person did the book. There was no collaborator, no really outside publisher, so they're often self-published as well.
Well, it could be a collaborative project.
Yeah.
But it was not a catalog. It didn't have an essay and then pictures, even if the pictures were made by the artist. So it could be collaborative. 2, 7, any number of people could have made the book, but it couldn't have an essay.
Okay, that's reasonable. Yeah.
So that was
Obviously, the gag book was a collaborative between two people.
what?
The guerrilla art action book
Right.
was a collaborative between the two people.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Keith, I see one back there.
Thank you. I would like to come back to mention before Koenig Bookshop in my question. They are completely different today. They turned into a very regular publishing house. But back in the day, I think artists could also submit their books to Koenig Bookshop. And I don't know if they had a particular limit, a run of the books that below that limit they wouldn't accept. But it happened many times. I heard that artists would actually write that their book was published in 500 copies when it was actually only made in 15 copies. And today, Koenig Verlag, it's a very large publishing house, but they keep a very little gallery that sells artist books, and the smaller edition is, of course, the better, the more precious the book is. And they try to reveal right now which books were actually very, very small editions, though they claimed to be much bigger because they would be treated more serious back in the day. That you had such examples of books that came in and said, well, we're edition of 100 or 200, and they turn out to be a very, very small edition of only, I don't know, 30 copies or something like this.
Yeah. But on demand also contradicts the earlier idea that you committed yourself to print in a certain way. On demand is like, well, here's one. Anyone interested? You know. It's not committing yourself. It's not committing yourself to printing a book, because by the time you get to 100 copies, it begins a serious operation that you've really thought about distributing and placing in people's hands. Doing one book, I mean, I wouldn't deny the value of one book, but that's not what this is about.
But
oh, quiet.
Yep.
But it's interesting because actually there's this really interesting development regarding that 100 mark, which even though it does underscore both, okay, we don't want to carry super limited editions, and B, we want a commitment to something that is meant to be broadly distributed and is relatively independently priced. We have about 700 copies of Anne Scales project in stock right now from the initial edition of 1,000 or 2,000. Really? It's at its original price of $5. It sells at a rate of once or twice a year. So it's going to be in print for the next 300 years. And 300 to 500 years. And what we see, and if you go to the New York Art and LA Art Book Fair and a lot of these independent publishers and the zine tent and such like that, is that there is technology now with risograph printing and other sources, as well as like the publishing residency we have at the ADWSE gallery with a collectively a group of people can get together and buy, a glue binder, a paper cutter, et cetera, and actually do their own actual manufacturing. And they're making editions that are very much in the spirit of large editions because they are intentionally inexpensive and meant to be inexpensive and accessible, but they're doing them in much smaller, realistic editions to actually meet the amount that they could anticipate to sell. So in editions of sometimes under 100, of 30 or 40 or 60, because that's reasonably what they could sell over the course of a couple of years. So it's this kind of interesting shift.
Yeah.
Can I convey some information that might seem partial, but I'm involved with a woman called Anne Meuglen-Delcroix, who is the French expert in this field, and the two of us have chosen titles to reprint, artist books to reprint. We're working with a publisher in France who is very committed to this, and we brought out a new edition of Lawrence Wiener, Richard Long, Herman de Vries, Peter Downsborough, and so these things need never go out of print if they're any good at all. They will come back, and this seems to be a relatively new phenomenon. Reprinting has existed before, but to suddenly target it, like a lot of people are targeting, like the gag reprint, some of these other publishers finding things that were valuable and reprinting them. This is a new evolution of the artist book, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And it's called reprint, and the publisher is ZLA. You can Google it and find out the rest about it. Excuse me for that plug, but
No, it's
Yeah, no, it's great.
Thank you. Yeah, I've sort of known printed matter, I guess, since certainly the Lippard days, and a little earlier than that, maybe, or not earlier, but very early on, let's say that. But what strikes me is there seems to be like two discussions, one about artist books and distribution and what that meant. But for me, I'm always intrigued with the moment when it was created and this idea of the founding of it. And I find that the kind of richness of the exchange, the dialogue, the thinking process, the fact that so many people came together, a relatively large number of people, that today I don't see that kind of environment. And I was wondering if Max can speak to, because you've been dealing with the internet aspect, is this kind of collaborative discussion, this kind of dialogue on how to bring something about, how to create a new space, is it becoming virtual as opposed to becoming physical? I tend to love the physical part, and I think that what was created was so important. But is the wave of the future that you've been seeing or been talking about as much in the virtual world as it is in the physical world?
I mean, like I said, Printed Matter wants to have a relationship with digital publishing and internet artist projects and things like that. I sometimes wonder if Lawrence Wiener and Saul LeWitt and others were coming of age today, would a book practice be such a big part of their focus? I mean, the book has certain things that internet doesn't have. It has multiple surfaces and sequences and things like that. That is a formal difference that you can't reproduce yet in digital form or on your iPhone or however many things those things can do.
Well, especially Saul and Lawrence are dedicated to the pencil.
Mm.
And
there's a drawing aspect
yes,
to what they do.
And a lot of the early book artists did have that drawing aspect.
Right.
And they like to draw.
Yeah.
And you can draw on the computer, but it's not the same.
Yeah, and I think that also relates to an answer to Bob's question, which is that the new generation of artists engaged in book practices are responding to the failure of a lot of the utopian digital, the digital utopia that they were raised on, as they see the kind of dark side of, free digital information does not actually mean free democracies around the world. It actually means it goes tandem with one of the biggest siphoning of wealth from the bottom to the top that we've ever seen in history, as well as corporate and state surveillance apparatuses and things like that. And that's these young artists, consciously or not being reactionary and Luddite and throwing away the technology, but are working, but have a specific interest in this, the tactility, not just the tactility and objectness of books and things like that, but the community of collaboration and the community of exchange. And again, circulating and passing and experience a book is a different experience than, than getting a, social media on your iPhone. That I think it's become clear that, virtual communities and virtual social space does not replace physical, social space and stuff.
I have to say one artist who you wouldn't expect has used digital media very well, and that's David Hockney. And David Hockney. And that's a surprise, but he did.
Well, I remember when CD-ROMs came out and we started getting CD-ROM submissions, and basically they sucked. Like, they were just poorly, like, the artists didn't, I remember there's a cool one that Louise Lawler did and some other, where they kind of successfully managed to use the technology, but some of them, they were just really hard to navigate and uninteresting, and they never, like, figured out the technology. And I'm curious, I haven't seen the Paul Chan e-books, but I'm curious to see those because, we wouldn't be against having those at Print Matter. Anyway.
I want to get back to your part about collaboration. There was a real desire in the late 70s, early 80s for artists to work together, and collaborative projects was this wonderful experience, but boy, it was horrible working together, really difficult. Group material was much more successful, but they kind of imploded as well after a while. And I'm thinking, it's interesting right now that CoLab has had a couple of shows recently in New York. There's a big book out on group material. Here we are tonight talking about the founding of Printed Matter. I think there is, historically, this moment...
Film on heresies, too.
Film on heresies. Historically, this moment is interesting. But I think for the next generation, I hope that they can be taught how to collaborate successfully. Negotiating a collaboration is really difficult. It's a skill. And one of the things I've stumbled across is this design thinking that's coming out of Stanford Design School. That's actually teaching people how to collaborate and bring in human resources, get them to work together to solve a problem. And it's a methodology about how to collaborate and make something. And I hope and it seems to be spreading a lot within a younger generation. And I think that's what we need, a method of collaboration, and be taught that early.
The period you were talking about when you were forming this, and prior to that, from 112 Green Street on, let's say, New York was still like people lived in the city. You lived where you could communicate. You lived together. You shared. You were close to each other. It could be Philip Glass dealing with the music. It could be somebody. All these things were going on around you, and it was a real community. The expense of living in New York today, and the need to create an income sufficient enough to stay here.
Right.
I think that it seems to me that it works against that sense of the collaborative that seemed to be more vital. Like there was more purpose to working or thinking through these things togetherly. And today, it seems like the drive is for the individuality of doing it. So that's why I was curious if there are environments of some sort, whether it's virtual or otherwise,
right,
that this can go on, because I think that's such a rich and important kind of expression of the cultural workers as opposed to the individual artists.
But that was where, my whole sense of collaboration came from political organizing to begin with. Collaboration at Heresies was always crazy. The first page of every single issue of Heresies said how horrible it had been working with everybody else and so on. But collaboration was, I think I always see collaboration as the social extension of collage, and collage aesthetic has always been something that drives me. But anyway.
Well, when we started Heresies, we didn't understand that everybody couldn't do everything. That we should have the people who did a thing best do that thing.
Yeah.
It took us a while.
But I do think it's a political impetus collaboration. No matter where if it ends up in completely art for art's sake or whatever.
But certainly it's an art that we can be trained, and we just don't, educators don't train people to collaborate as well as they should. And that's something schools need to pick up a little bit.
Anyway. And also, as I see, is that a lot of these collaborations they're happening across different media. So there are these, physical community aspects of the collaboration, as well as taking full advantage of the kind of communication capabilities and collaborative capabilities of, you know, of the internet and current technology. So I see them working like that.
Any more questions?
Should
we conclude? I'm getting a nod from my handler. Thank you all for coming, and if any of you are able to help us put down, any of the young, energetic people want to help us put away the chairs, that would be really awesome. This is a DIY Judson Church collaboration.